with Jason Killpack, who's the Director of Business Development at Topcon, and we want to talk to Jason about TopNet Live, which is Topcon's correction service.
Sure.
And all its kind of permutations and what kind of impact and positive benefit can TopNet Live and correction services more generally bring to bear to a room full of a bunch of drone operators doing all manner of projects. What do you think, Jason?
Well, it's a great utility. So it's a part of a grander utility in the fact that we all are exposed to GNSS signals every day. We see them everywhere we are, in our phone, in our car. They add to the value of our life. And the correction services that Topcon provides globally add to that value of life. We have a lot of mechanical ways in which we get better accuracy or different functions for the drones in this building flying around. Very common for them to use post-process kinematic to that methodology to process the GPS signal or the GNSS signals down to get accuracy on the project.
Sure.
And what the correction services do is
typically that PPK processing, or how much time does that add to a project? Typically,
it all depends, Richard. So you've got to put on your ground control.
Yep.
Then you got to fly your drone.
Yep.
Then you got to store your raw data on your base, and you got to have your raw data on your drone. Then you got to coordinate everything, post-process it. Could be a matter of days from the time you deploy in the field to the time you have the answer that you want. The nice thing with TopNet Live is if that drone has a capacity for an internet connection, I can correct the signal while that thing flies. That means all the data that is collected from the sensors on that drone in the air is all coordinated at that time. When that thing lands, we know what it did, we saw what it did, and all of our answers are accurate.
Wow.
So that's one particular application.
Yeah, I mean, that's one application of one user segment that is represented at this conference.
That's correct.
Pretty significant. Why are corrections new for this market particularly?
Corrections aren't necessarily new. The way they're being used and commercialized are.
Okay, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure.
Give us a couple of examples, if you will.
Well, the standard bearer for our industry in the corrections world was what was called a CORS station, continuously operating reference station. And 15 years ago, that was the absolute top of the mark. You'd have a fixed reference station on a fixed position, and it had a big radio, and it would tell the world and any receiver that wanted to hear it the correction it had. What's changed is the technology to deliver the correction isn't by radio, and the number of the positions, the continually operating reference stations, now in the TopNet Live network is over 1,200 just in the Americas.
Wow.
Today. There's thousands of them in Western Europe. There's a new network for TopNet Live turning on in Japan this month. It should be 1,300 stations.
Wow.
We have interest from across the world. And what's really interesting is we're one of the few services that can provide that ground-based RTK position through one source in all of those markets. That's the catch.
So for the large enterprise users who are able to deploy or have the luxury of having a market where they can deploy anywhere in the globe, they can use TopNet Live?
In most markets, yes.
Wow. Okay. So really of particular value to those larger kind of enterprise users.
Incredibly valuable. And in smaller markets, smaller enterprises, it lessens the complexity of the deployment. So recently, our company is based in California, and there was a lot of flooding and a lot of emergency services that happened there.
Sure.
You and I talked about this at a previous discussion, but
Yeah.
we actually opened up our correction services to anybody that could use them because it was an emergency. And that means people from out of state that had GPS-related products that could handle network corrections just were able to do it. And that's a powerful thing. Instead of having to set up a mobile base station, find out what frequencies on the radio to use, coordinate with other people that are in your team.
Right.
Everything has the same basic correction.
And you now made that service free so that you were responding to a set of conditions on the ground in which, this was Northern California, there was significant flooding, mudslides, a levee actually broke, and you provided these free subscriptions almost instantaneously.
Yes.
Such that the first responders and emergency services personnel and the people who were there who were kind of doing the follow-up work, all the survey necessary to kind of measure the land deformation, measure the road systems, you provided that free.
Yes.
Wow.
And then we did that as a function of an emergency service.
Sure.
And there's a time limit on that. But,
Right.
But the point was, at the time, we have distributors around the globe. And in our last international dealer meeting for the Americas, that was a request from several of our network correction providers where they'd had a hurricane or other maladies happen in their region, and they needed to provide a service. And we felt that had merit. And the first exercise of that actually happened in our home state of California at a time where it was needed.
Right. So the point is that it's not some kind of marketing, gimmick. The bottom line is, you're trying to help people.
Yeah.
You're trying to, there is a, particularly in safety of life applications, there is a window in which responders have, time and to be able to get to people where and when they're needed. And there are probably other examples around the world that where this is going to be kind of an ongoing thing, in which that kind of those corrections really provide another layer of capability to emergency services, which means they may be able to save people's lives.
Definitely. And the fact of the matter is that it becomes yet another iteration of the utility of positioning. And our CEO, Ray O'Connor, likes to say, accuracy is addictive. The more accurate it can get, the more addictive it becomes. And that's very, very true, because we need to know the elevation of that levee. We need to know it before it floods. We need to know when it fails, and we need to know what it was after the fact.
Sure.
And there's all kinds of permutations of that, and a network gives us a unique opportunity to have a utility that doesn't change, that provides that level of accuracy, and moving on forward, it continues to provide that same source of accuracy.
Yeah. So you're here. I mean, the emergency services, first responders, they're well represented here. Survey community, construction, well represented here. What kind of, and you've got customers of TopNet Live in almost every kind of user community that exists here. Where do you see the most appropriate deployment or of TopNet Live corrections for other unmanned or uncrewed operations? What kind of conversations are you having here this year? And then how does that kind of contrast with some of the conversations that you were having maybe 2 or 3 years ago?
Sure. 2 or 3 years ago, well, it wasn't a conversation to have.
Okay.
The technology hasn't changed much, but the densification of the stations has.
Got it.
The marketability of the services and the growth of the interest in the different markets has driven all of it.
So could you just pause there for a moment? So talking about the densification of the network, and so that's taken time. You're building out, and this is basically infrastructure that you're building out.
Yeah.
And now with the level of density that you currently deploy now, what does that mean?
Well, it means we've still got work to do to densify the network to
Sure.
have it all completely covered. Our goal is to cover every primary and secondary highway in every major and minor metropolitan area. And that comes with the cooperation. And one thing we didn't talk about in too much detail is TopNet Live is a cooperative network. So it's comprised of independent distributors that invest in it, independent companies that have different commercial interests that invest in it, and Topcon's dealers and subsidiaries. So we're consistently adding to the growth curve in an exponential fashion because we have more and more commercial interests that need to have and must require that level of instant on, turn the key on and it's fixed and it's ready to go. That could be a drone that takes off in the air immediately. It could be an ag tractor. It could be a large piece of construction equipment. It could be a surveyor running out in a rainstorm trying to figure out the elevation of a road. All of that is conductive of our network. So the new business models that we're starting to see are OEM business models where you have a product system that's being delivered by a manufacturer that might be here at this show. And they say, we've got a wonderful product. It flies perfectly in the case of a drone.
Yeah.
And it's got all these capabilities to get really, really accurate results. It's up to you, Mr. Customer. And Mr. Customer is like, geez, I don't know. Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do the other thing? Now the conversation is the OEM that builds that product says, can I just build that level of accuracy into my device? Can I partner with you and make my device work better for my customers? And I can own the performance of the product that I built. And that's where we see real big interest. Where in the previous iterations of products coming out, it was always a very good product, but its capabilities were changed depending on if it had RTK accuracy or it had PPK accuracy, and what each process meant, where those corrections came from, what kind of software solved the problem. Now, that same company that makes the drone can turnkey that whole delivery mechanism directly to their customer. They manage it, they own it, and they see their customer succeed all the way through. That's the value.
Yeah, that's I mean, there really is, when you put it that way, there really isn't a drone operator or an unmanned kind of user that wouldn't benefit from corrections.
No.
Period.
No, and the proliferation of it becomes so great that it's not a nice to have, it's a need to have.
Yeah. So particularly when you're dealing with at an OEM kind of design level, it really can be positioned. It really is kind of an enabling capability when you're dealing with OEMs. And one of the things that I know that TopNet Live and Topcon brings is that it's an open architecture.
That's correct.
And frankly, there are many other large correction services that nowhere, it doesn't enjoy that kind of open architecture. They would argue that there's a very good reason for it, but I think it's very interesting that Topcon takes kind of a more, egalitarian approach when it comes to their corrections and the integration thereof. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's a fairly novel approach, and it's not the only one, but I think it's an important consideration, particularly when you're dealing with OEM markets and emerging markets who don't really have an understanding of what those corrections, A, are, and B, what they can kind of deliver.
Sure. So the technology business, we've all had our different phone plans, different phone providers, different types of phones. It's not a great example, but that's an example of proprietary technology.
There you go.
And so where we find the most adoption is in generalized adoption. Most of us use Amazon Prime or Amazon. It doesn't matter if we access it on our phone, we access it on our PC, or we access it on a tablet. We get the same use case. Now, how would Amazon be different today if they produced the only interface for their service? They wouldn't be nearly as successful because the user experience wouldn't be the same.
Right.
Richard would have to have his own Amazon tablet to do his own Amazon ordering. He couldn't do it from his hotel room with a different product, different system. We look at correction services the same.
It's a really good example.
Yeah, GNSS is a ubiquitous service, and the correction methodology for it is an understood international standard.
Yeah.
All of the manufacturers for GNSS chipsets understand and can utilize those generic uniform corrections. We embrace that. So we produce correction services that any manufacturer that can support the generic interface can utilize.
And what advantage is that, and not kind of conceptually, but in kind of practice, what benefit has Topcon enjoyed from taking that approach?
Lots. The primary one is there's an incredible headspace that's needed to do precise integrations of your own chipsets into other products.
Great point.
And so from the Topcon manufacturing standpoint, we need to have project management, product management, and some managerial control over somebody else's product to put our products in there. And we're happy to do that. In some cases we do. We have very good commercial relationships that do that. However, if we have to do that for every particular customer that could possibly utilize our correction services, we couldn't have enough people. And the other piece applies on the other side. The OEM may have already found their commercially available chipset. They might have already found their commercial chipset, and they might have already settled on it. They might have made a layout, a encasement, some kind of a chassis, whatever it is, for a chipset that has a smaller profile, a lower power consumption than my engineering people have made for certain applications.
Sure.
And so if that's the case, why prevent them from enjoying the same level of corrections that we do? No sense. And
so they can actually focus on what they do best.
That's right.
Yeah.
And their customers have a built-in system that works. We'll provide the test beds, we'll provide all the test data, the access needed for an OEM to come in and utilize our network. We have no problem doing that. We do it all the time. And they can
That's impressive.
And they can take whatever chipset they want, and we'll help them integrate.
Yeah. That's a fairly enlightened approach, I would say, compared to some of the closed network, closed architecture competitors that are out there.
Yeah, and ultimately we're stronger together.
Agreed. Nobody goes it alone.
That's right.
Well, that's a great way to end. Nobody goes it alone. It's been a pleasure talking with Jason Killpack, Director of Business Development at Topcon and TopNet Live. This is Richard Fisher at Inside Unmanned Systems, Inside GNSS, and Autonomous Media saying thank you, live from Denver. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Richard.